afternoon, my beautiful babes and babes. I'm wearing a t-shirt because Canadian winter sucks and is over and can go away goodbye. I'm your resident active advocate in a very good mood because it is spring. Hurrah. And today I would like to talk to you about arguably the best masterpiece to come out of the Disney Renaissance, which is Beauty and the Beast. Now, the Disney Renaissance was huge. This movie made it huger. That's a word. Yes, it is. The main conceit of Beauty and the Beast, as I'm sure most of you are aware, even from the remake, is that Belle, this lovely girl, who is a dreamer, who is very literate, who is very well read, and, has a great imagination and is extraordinarily intellectual, as compared to many of the people in her town, she is taken prisoner by a beast who was cursed to be a beast due to his greed and his selfishness by an enchantress who came to his castle looking for shelter. The problem is that, well, the beast himself is not necessarily, he doesn't necessarily fall within the disability continuum, except perhaps in the realm of mental health, because you can imagine that after all these years alone, he's quite depressed. The problem is, along with the beast, the servants of the castle were also cursed. I don't understand why this was done. In the live action remake, they did sort of give an explanation that when the prince was being abused by his father growing up, therefore turning him into an inward, quote, monster, which was then reflected by his outward appearance later on. The servants sat back and did nothing while this was going on. I don't see that as a proper explanation because back in the old-timey fairy tale days, even in the real world, or especially in the real world, servants would not have had any power over their masters to say, you should not be treating your family this way, you should not be acting this way, you should not be treating us this way, moreover. So the fact that they are cursed right along with the prince, to me, seems grossly unfair, but the bulk of the disability narrative actually falls on them. When it comes to how they were transformed, though, they were not transformed into beasts. They were transformed into household objects. Water bottle, phone, hairbrush, these sorts of things, most of which would not have existed back then. But anyway, so you get the people transformed into ordinary household objects, such as Cogsworth being turned into a clock, Lumiere being turned into a candelabra, and Mrs. Potts and her son Chip being turned respectively into a teapot and a chipped teacup. Now, here's the thing about this. Due to magic movie power and due to magic story power, they have the ability to get around. Were a person actually turned into suspension of disbelief, were a person actually turned into a household object, where have their legs gone? Where have their arms gone? How are they capable of getting around exactly? That and the fact that, especially for those who are more fragile, made of glass, for example, how would they get, even if they can move around, okay, how would they get up to shelves and off of those shelves and things of that sort without breaking? I think that that's a point that ought to have been addressed, but definitely was not addressed. Again, fairy tale logic. Suspension of disbelief is required here, of course. But the fact remains that these people were totally 100% stripped of their human incarnation and are now made to get around in very specific ways that are not native to them. This could definitely be a narrative of acquired disability. The thing is, it all happens in this one place, so it's very insular, and they only have one another to associate with, so they're not being judged from the outside. They also do not judge one another, given that the same fate has befallen all of them. despite the fact that, as I say, I don't believe that they were culpable in any of this, but that's just my own personal opinion. Disney, modern Disney, does not agree with me, which I think is dumb. But anyway. In particular, I find it sad that Chip would have been transformed into a chipped teacup, as I say, because Chip was a child. How much responsibility could he have had, even in the sort of ad-libbed Disney explanation in the modern remake? How much responsibility could this child have had for what happened in the prince's life? This boy is much, much younger than the prince, like at least a decade younger, if not more. So, how does that work exactly? In a lot of ways, this story does not make sense, especially in terms of the modern remake, because again, they're laying culpability for what happened to the prince on the servants rather than on his parents. You don't see his parents anywhere in the story, but getting away from that sphere, let's get into the narrative as it concerns Belle and the Beast. The Beast, we never actually know his real name, by the way. I think canonically it's supposed to be Adam, but he's never called that in the movie. The Beast is required to fall in love with someone who can see him for who he truly is in order to break the spell that has befallen him and his servants and his castle. We're not told exactly when this happened, by the way, because the strange part of the narrative is that none of these characters ever grow up in Chip's case or die in the case of other characters who could have been older. The prince never seems to age, but it's said that the castle is moldering and old and forgotten about, and the people have sort of turned to one another within the town for a form of self rule. It doesn't really seem that they are ruled by a monarch, either near or distant. But the problem with that is that it messes with its own timeline because the rose in the West Tower, as it loses its petals, that is the indication that the curse is here to stay. Should the rose lose its final petal, and this was basically the condition of the contract, should the rose lose its final petal before the beast falls in love, then he and his servants will be stuck as they are. In the modern remake, however, it's even said that the servants will become inanimate objects and like not even just go around as household objects. They will cease to have human cognizance whatsoever. I think that's much more cruel, just for the record. But so the beast himself is quite desperate, of course, to fall in love. The problem is you can't force yourself to fall in love, nor can you force someone else to fall in love with you. People have made the interpretation that Belle succumbs to Stockholm syndrome. I don't believe that's necessarily accurate because she only actually starts having any sort of feeling towards him after he stops being a jerk to her. Towards the beginning of her captivity in his castle, I like Belle because she actually has a spine. She tells him off. She tells him no. She says to him, "Well, if you hadn't done this, then this thing wouldn't have happened, and then you wouldn't be yelling at me right now. So stop yelling at me." You know, that whole scene with him saving her from the wolves. You can see that he has feelings for her at that point, albeit from a selfish motive, which is the motive of getting his human form back. I don't know whether he's even concerned about his servants at this point necessarily, or even in the future whether he is. Just the whole point is to reverse the curse before it comes to fruition, and they're all stuck that way permanently. So you get the portrayal of a very selfish human being here in the Beast, and I would not classify that as any form of narcissism necessarily. It was just how he was raised. Even in the real world, world leaders are often seen to be very selfish, very greedy individuals, which, in my opinion, doesn't make them fit to be leaders. But there you go. So, in the context of this story, though, he has to shed those traits before anyone will properly fall in love with him and before he is capable of properly falling in love with anyone else. Love is the opposite of greed, the opposite of selfishness, the opposite of fear. And he needs to shed all of those before he is properly capable of falling in love with Belle. So going up against the wolves, for example, is quite indicative of his lack of fear in rescuing this woman. It could be out of fear of, well, if I don't, then she'll be killed and I'll have lost my, as I perceive it now, one and only chance at reversing this curse. But you don't really cognate like that in an emergency situation. You just sort of act, the fight or flight reflex, as it were, right? So, in performing that act, that would, I think, be considered an act of true love. He also does the same towards the end of the movie when he puts himself between Belle and Gaston. Gaston is a real piece of work. He is the real beast of the movie, shall we say, even though the beast himself, as I have said, is a selfish jerk, at least at the beginning. But I think that his traits of inherent selfishness, of self obsession, they're all sort of put onto Gaston as the beast's transformation into a good person takes place. So you go from having a literal beast to a figurative beast in the form of Gaston, who attempts to murder the literal beast so that he can't run off with the one whom Gaston presumes to be, quote, his woman, right? I will marry Belle. Belle will marry me. I'm the best man in the village. How can she not? Everyone loves me. Everyone desires me. That is narcissism. All right. So Gaston is very full of himself. But I mean, he's again reinforced by his environment to be this way. Everyone is always singing his praises, his adulations. And I mean, you get a literal song called Gaston, which could be this movie's villain song, really. It's the trait of almost every Disney Renaissance movie to have a villain song. In this movie you have Gaston. In Little Mermaid you have Poor Unfortunate Souls. In The Lion King you have Be Prepared, so on and so forth. I think that the villain songs are sometimes the catchiest in the movie. Although I have to say my favorite song in this movie is Tale as Old as Time. I would sing it for you, but I'm really afraid of copyright strikes because Disney is jealously watchful of their content being used by other creators, and especially little minnows like me. I'm only a minnow. Right. So, meanwhile, back at the plot, this is not exactly insta-love either, which I appreciate. It's not really specified how long she's there. You do see the rose lose one or two more petals from the start of her stay to the end of her stay, and the last petal is just clinging on by a hair. Not a hair, whatever petals have, by the end when she kisses him and says out loud, I love you, after he literally takes a knife in the back to protect her. So again, that shows, I think, a lack of fear on his part as well as a lack of his characteristic selfishness. And as I say, both of those things are inimical to love. They're the opposite of love. Love is freedom from fear. Love is freedom from selfishness. Love is freedom from greed. If you really love someone, you will not be any of those things with them, to them, and for them. So love is also the opposite of control, which is why I think that Bill does not have Stockholm Syndrome, because at this point he has stopped trying to control her. He has said to her, you're free to go. You're free to leave whenever you please. I know that I took you in as a prisoner. I am very sorry. And you can see in my magic mirror, which I haven't brought up before now, but he has this magic mirror that he can look at people with. You can see in my magic mirror that your father is very sick and you should go home. You should take care of him. And it is through letting her go that Belle, I think, solidifies her perception of the quote beast. At this point, he ceases to be selfish. He ceases to cling to her through fear of what the curse will do to him. And that's the reason why she goes back. So that is my argument in favor of the romance in this movie. It's quite a lot better than a lot of Disney romances up to that point. And I think that the Beast's narrative is quite interesting because he is beset by quite a few of these conditions that come as a result of him having been raised to be the kind of person that Gaston actually is. But then the Beast realizes, oh, hey, by the way, I'm not naturally narcissistic. I'm not self-obsessed. I'm not meant to be the center of attention forevermore. I might be the prince, but the whole purpose of a prince is to look after those under their dominion. And this especially applies in this case to Belle and to the people who have been turned into household objects in his castle. Keyboard, mouse, Fitbit. All right, I'm getting sick of this. That's my video for today. Please leave your comments, questions, queries, and concerns and snide remarks down in the comment section below. Like, share, subscribe, and I will see y'all tomorrow for another discussion of another lovely Disney Renaissance movie. All right. Very well. Mwah.